What's up, film fans? I've got a few questions for you.
You talking to me? You talking to me?
Do you know me?
Well, I think I would have remembered.
Have we ever met?
When's the last time you picked your feet?
Did we get you a little, huh? Just a little bit? Us city folk?
Well, do you, punk?
Well, do you? Let me tell you this. If you're interested in the new Hollywood period, today's your lucky day. Hey everybody, this video is the first part in a new series of videos I'm doing on the rise and fall of New Hollywood. Over the next several weeks, I'll be putting out short videos that cover different aspects of how New Hollywood came about, what happened at its peak, and then its demise as the blockbuster era took over. In each of the videos, I'll cover different historical, production, narrative aspects about how something like New Hollywood could happen. How could the French Connection win a Best Picture Oscar?
You talking to me, baby?
Yeah, I'm talking to you. Come here. Get up. Come on.
What's happening, baby?
Where you been, huh?
I've been in there.
You stand a toss?
Sure, I'm clean.
You use shit?
No, man.
Get up.
Oh, man, who are you? Dick Tracy somebody. I said I was clean.
I'm not gonna get stuck, am I?
No, I said I'm clean, didn't I?
I do. You know what happens.
Yeah, I said I'm clean. Oh, motherfucker, don't
Hey,
get
man.
fucking over me. I'll kick your motherfucking ass.
How did stars like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Karen Black, Ellen Burstyn rise to the top to become the preeminent performers of the 1970s era? How did Hollywood let these filmmakers experiment in the ways that they did?
Young directors knew something that they didn't know, which was maybe what the audiences were looking for. And so there was this climate which made it possible for me to make a lot of movies, which I know I couldn't get made now.
How did Hollywood invest in new technologies that these filmmakers wanted so that they could challenge the way Hollywood had been making pictures for 70 years and reorient them towards something more personal, more expressive, and certainly counter in a lot of ways to the Hollywood that had come an Throughout the process of this series, I also want to kind of challenge some of the stories that have already been told about New Hollywood. The idea of an era of maverick geniuses who took Hollywood by storm and who ripped their stories large across the 1970s as these powerful men who wouldn't take no for an answer has been told over and over again. And part of the reason it's been told over and over again is because there's some truth to it, but it's not the whole truth. So one of the things I'll do in this series is kind of tweak that, interrogate that, and sometimes even dismantle some of it. In this video though, I just want to establish some terminology that we can use going forward. What is New Hollywood and when is New Hollywood? And I'll start with the latter question. The first thing to keep in mind is that any era, whether of art or politics or any other sort of component of human culture, doesn't just begin on January 1st of some year and end on December 31st of a later year. There are always roots and there are always predecessors. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we talk about New Hollywood. It's generally considered to have begun in 1967. This is the year that Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate were released. The Graduate was a quasi-independent film. Bonnie and Clyde was a full studio film from Warner Brothers, both made on small budgets, which made huge box office, and both of which at the time seemed to ignite a new fervor of film going. A fervor amongst the younger generation, the people today we call the boomers, who had been turning away from cinema going for several years. Although great films came out throughout the decade of the 1960s, by the late 60s, Hollywood was in the doldrums financially and, some would argue, creatively, and young people weren't going to see films as frequently as they had in previous decades. With The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, and then some films that came out soon after that, like Easy Rider, The Wild Bunch, young people started to go to the cinema again, and they started to expect a different kind of film, a different kind of storytelling, and a different kind of movie making. Certainly, there are roots in New Hollywood before 1967, and you can look at films by Stanley Kubrick, by John Cassavetes, by Sidney Lumet, that displayed some of the stylistic, some of the thematic, some of the sort of production approach that would become the norm during the New Hollywood era. But when we consider it actually kicking off as a creative movement and also in an industrial movement, which I'll talk more about in later videos, 1967 is when we say it began. When did it end? There is some dispute about this, and like any era, as I said, it doesn't just end on December 31st. There's three kind of general approaches to this. Some argue that it ended in the early 70s, by 1972, that already Hollywood studios were reestablishing a kind of hierarchical approach to filmmaking, and they were reacting to the kind of boomer or hippie or idealistic thinking behind those late 60s films. Someone like Peter Level look at films like The French Connection or Dirty Harry and say that those are kind of reactionary films. Those are fascist films, and or at least proto-fascist films, and the popularity of films like that where brutal cops can sort of beat up on foreigners and hippies signals an end to the New Hollywood era. That's a very strict reading that most scholars and film critics don't go by, but it's out there. Another very common definition for the end of New Hollywood is around sort of 76, 77 in the wake of Jaws and Star Wars. So what you get is the beginning of the blockbuster era. And there are studio elements to this too, as the studios started to be run by people who understood the industry better. Again, this is something I'll talk about in a future video, but they started to have less patience or tolerance for the artistic notions of the directors who had made so many of the early 70s New Hollywood films.
I mean, we all made a picture or two that were more expensive than they should have been, and they didn't work. And then people said, well, maybe they don't know.
There was a big to-do about how the film director had too much freedom, had too much money, had too much power, and a group was gonna, come there and put the film director in its place.
They saw that with a film like Jaws, Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There was a whole different kind of money to be made in filmmaking, and they didn't have to hitch their wagon to these small personal films that one would hope would strike a chord in an audience and then blow up. They started to develop the formula for the blockbuster era.
There's only one Spielberg, only one Lucas. And I think what happened there is that they all ran to that group. It's not the filmmakers' fault. It's those who wanted to cash in on that and use that as a gauging of what a success should be in Hollywood.
The ending date that I usually go by is 1980. And what you get in the late 70s is a kind of intermingling of late stage New Hollywood and early stage blockbuster era. And the reason I like to go with 1980 is because in the late 70s, you still get New Hollywood films. You still get Hal Ashby directing Coming Home and being there. You still get Woody Allen, as sort of verboten as he might be these days, making a film like Annie Hall. You get Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven. And I think to say those films aren't New Hollywood films just because they're in the blockbuster era kind of misreads what was actually going on. So for the sake of this series, I'm going to consider New Hollywood 1967 to 1980. What is New Hollywood? Well, there's the question that this whole series is going to delve into. First though, before we get to the answer to that, let's talk a little bit about terminology. I use the term New Hollywood, and I'll use that throughout this series. But a lot of scholars and film critics don't really like that term. And they have a good argument. Hollywood and film critics started using the term new to describe Hollywood as early as the 1950s at least. One thing to keep in mind is that there was no stasis in terms of how studios and agents and production companies made films. It was constantly evolving. And every few years, from the 20s onward, if we want to talk about the coming of sound, it would seem like something new was happening in the way films were being made. And those could be production things like sound or widescreen or color. Those could be contractual things, which we'll talk about, like the Olivia de Havilland case or the Paramount Decree. Those could be business things like the rise of agents in the pre-production process and so on. Critics would look at this, Hollywood insiders would look at this and say, oh, this is new. And so in some ways, some scholars would argue New Hollywood to describe the 70s is kind of an empty term because there are too many New Hollywoods. One of which is New Hollywood to describe the blockbuster era. And you'll come across that as well. So you have to be careful, or you have to pay attention when someone uses the term New Hollywood, because they might mean the 50s, they might mean the 70s, they might mean Top Gun. I still prefer the term because for me, it's fairly widespread. You'll find it used in book titles, you'll find it used in film courses, you'll find it used in academic conferences. So New Hollywood works. Other terms you might come across that are used to describe the same era are the Hollywood New Wave. That's not a favorite term of mine because while New Hollywood filmmakers were influenced by the French New Wave or German New Cinema or other European New Waves, it's still very much embedded in a studio tradition. They're trying to upend that tradition, they're trying to modify that tradition, but it's still very much embedded in that studio tradition. And you can see that in their influences. Yes, they were influenced by Godard and they were influenced by Kurosawa, but they were also influenced by John Ford and Howard Hawks and John Huston and so on. I will talk about in this series the films outside of Hollywood that are still part of that American cinema, like the 70s films of John Cassavetes or Barbara Loden's Wanda, or the LA Rebellion of African Americans based in Los Angeles. Because there was a lot going on outside of Hollywood that was kind of new wave-ish that influenced filmmakers inside New Hollywood, and there was a dialogue going on, and that'll come up in some later videos. But for me, the term new wave doesn't quite work. Another one is the Hollywood Renaissance, and again, it's a term that I don't really prefer, but some scholars do like that one, and you'll come across it as well. So just know that for the purposes of this series, I'm going to call it New Hollywood, but you might find the same era referred to as New Wave or Renaissance, and you might find other eras referred to as New Hollywood. Just make sure that whatever you're reading or whatever film you're watching, you're aware of the terminology that's being used because it's still shifting, and that's the nature of scholarly and critical discourse. So it's not like this is the only thing around which terminology is contested. What is New Hollywood then? And I'm only going to give a brief overview here because this is the point of the series. Basically, when we talk about New Hollywood, we're talking about an era of filmmaking when the studio system as we knew it from the 30s to roughly the 50s or early 60s was undergoing rapid and in some ways unpredictable transformation. The old Hollywood guard was dying off. That includes studio heads, producers, some stars, some directors, cinematographers, and so on. They didn't all die at the end of 1966. Billy Wilder kept making films. John Huston kept making films. John Wayne starred in films. And these people stuck around, but new blood, fresh blood came into this era when the studio system was in upheaval, and they saw an opportunity. They saw an opportunity to make a different kind of film. And the reason 67 is so important is that Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate were different kinds of film. If you're a young film scholar or film student today, or just a film fan, and you look at The Graduate, you might find some of that montage editing or that match on action editing a little bit cheesy or cliche. But at the time, that was pretty non-standard in Hollywood. And it's dressing up this bleak story about, almost about the pointlessness of existence as a kind of generational romance. So it's a film that's at once inspirational and cynical. And that kind of appealed to these young boomers who believed they were going to bring about free love and change the world, but also looked around them and saw that cities were burning and their country was bombing villages in Vietnam and so on. So there is a sense of hopefulness and cynicism at the same time. And Bonnie and Clyde is quite similar. They're young, they're in love, they rob banks, and they get their faces blown apart at the end of the movie, right? So when those films were as successful as they were, other filmmakers said, I can do that. And you get Easy Rider, and you get The Wild Bunch, and then you get Mean Streets, and then you get The French Connection, and The Godfather, and Chinatown, and so on. And the reason the upheaval in the studio system is important here is that as the studios were being bought by conglomerates, I'll talk about this in a future video, as old studio heads were leaving, new people were put in place to run the studios. And those people saw youth-orientated films with a new approach to narrative, to theme, and to style could be made for little money and make huge profits. So they were willing to give these filmmakers the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, go out and make Mean Streets. Yeah, go out and make MASH. Yeah, go out and make Harold and Maude, a movie about a suicidal young man who falls in love with a 79-year-old woman, has sex with her, discovers the meaning of life through that relationship, just as she takes pills on her 80th birthday to end her own life. What? What? That's the kind of films that Peter Bart and Robert Evans were willing to make. John Calley at Warner Brothers was willing to make. So we get this moment in time when the films that were coming out of Hollywood were challenging, were formally and stylistically not avant-garde, they're still Hollywood films, but playful, experimental. They took chances with editing and cinematography and narrative. Lots of open, ambiguous endings. Protagonists who are unlikable. They took advantage of the new rating standards to include violence and sex and sexuality and language that you wouldn't have seen in films from the early to mid 60s. So what New Hollywood is an era in which American independent filmmaking, experimental filmmaking, and popular filmmaking all kind of merged for a short while because there was an audience who wanted to see those kind of films, and there was a production infrastructure that was willing to bankroll those kinds of films. And once some new studio heads came in by the end of the decade, they realized we don't have to take all these chances. Let's just make another Star Wars. Let's just make another Close Encounters. And a lot of times they failed, but then they'd make E.T. or Top Gun, and the money would keep rolling in.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
So if that sounds interesting to you, please join me over the next several weeks as I'll be putting up a series of videos on the rise and fall of New Hollywood. Until next time, my name's Aaron Hunter. Thanks for watching.